Alright, so let's see if I can knock out a card review today, as I do believe the expansion is being released tomorrow. So I'm going to go through all the cards and rate them on a scale from 1 to 5. The 5-star cards are the super insane cards, like the deck definers, the format definers, things like Baku, Katharina, Psychic Scream, Spreading Plague, all that kind of stuff. Or 5-star cards might also just be the kind of cards that are so powerful and efficient you pretty much throw them into every deck of that class. Things like Northshire Cleric, where you start by putting in 2 copies, and then try to find a reason not to play it, rather than with most cards where you try to find a reason to play them. The 4-star cards are going to be less powerful than that, but I still expect them to see play. Things like maybe SI7 Agent or Savannah Highmane, that kind of power level. The 3-star cards I think are probably fringe playable, maybe like a 1-of makes it into a competitive deck, like as the 29th or 30th best card you can be playing, or maybe they're tech cards, things like all the secret hate cards we've seen in the past, or maybe a card that I think might show up in the specialist format. The 2-star cards are where most of the cards are going to land, cards that I don't expect to see play. That's just kind of the nature of card games, right? Most of the cards in the set aren't going to see any play. And then the 1-star cards are the ones that I think are extra terrible, the kind that, as I'm scrolling through my collection, I'm not even going to try to find a reason to put them in my deck because they're just that bad. I don't think there are very many 1-star cards in general, and not in this set either. So anyway, let's start with Druid. First card is Crystal Power. So this is another one of those Arcane Shot type cards, 1 mana deal 2 damage, and those tend to see play. But this one can't go face, which is a pretty big deal. A lot of times with like Holy Smite or whatever, you're trying to combo that with Malygos and kill the opponent. And Druid is a Malygos class, so not being able to go face is definitely a downside. But this of course does have the flexibility of also being cast as a flash heal. So you can use it to kill the opponent's Flame Imp before it beats you up, or after it beats you up you can use it to heal back some of the damage it dealt to you. And of course in this set they're pushing some healing Druid synergy, and this seems like one of the most efficient ways for Druid to restore health. So if that's a thing, I think it's going to be a pretty powerful card. But in general, I think the most important aspect of this card is that it's a playable choose one card to go with Keeper Stalladris. Keeper Stalladris is obviously a pretty powerful effect that's sort of just limited by the card pool, and anything that's playable that goes along with that I think has a decent shot at seeing play. And on top of that, this is also just a cheap spell. Druid in the past has played Violet Teacher, Gadgets and Auctioneer. So even though I don't think this card is like particularly insane, I think it has a lot of things going for it, all the different synergies for different archetypes. And we also have to keep in mind that Jasper Spellstone is rotating out of standard, so just a nice cheap way to deal with some early minions, and has some uses later on in the game. I found myself putting this in most of my non-aggro Druid decks. Next up is Acornbearer. 5 stars, this card is insane. It's a relatively well-statted 1-drop, 1 mana 2/1, and then when it dies, it gives you a 2-drop. A 1-drop that gives you a 2-drop. This card is super insane. It's 3 bodies and 1 card, which obviously Druid likes that because they play things like Power of the Wild and Savage Roar. However, we have seen that the most recent competitive iteration of Token Druid has not been an aggro deck. It's been a Wild Growth, Nourish, Spreading Plague, Ultimate Infestation deck, where I don't think this Acornbearer would really fit. But Druid is losing a lot of those cards. Plague and Ultimate Infestation rotate, the ramp cards got nerfed, Branching Paths gets rotated out. So I think there's a good chance that going forward, Token Druid is going to be an aggro deck again, and I actually think this card is so insane that it might be the reason that Token Druid exists and is an aggro deck. It's just really hard to overstate how powerful efficient 1-drops are. Next up we have another Token Druid card, but one that I'm a little less impressed with. Blessing of the Ancients. So you compare this card to Mark of the Lotus, you're paying 3 times as much for the same effect. But Mark of the Lotus is kinda low-key, well I think it's low-key at least, like one of the most broken cards ever printed. So there's definitely room for a card to be worse than Mark of the Lotus and still be playable. but I think this card is just a little bit too inefficient to see too much play. If you're playing an aggro token druid, I think paying 3 mana for this effect is just way too expensive. You're not ever going to have time to cast this. And I think if you're playing a more value-oriented token druid deck, the kind of deck that might play the Forest's Aid or something like that, I think this just isn't really enough value for what that deck is trying to do. So even though it is powerful to have 2 copies of this effect in one card, and I wouldn't be like terribly surprised to see it seeing play, I think it's going to end up being a little bit too inefficient. Although I did build several token druid decks, and this card made it as a one of in exactly one of those decks. So that's why I'm going to give it 3 stars instead of 2. I think it has a slim possibility of sneaking its way in as the 30th card. Next up we have the Forest's Aid, a card I just referenced with Blessing of the Ancients. So at a glance I think it's pretty easy to write this card off. 8 mana for 5 2/2s is pretty inefficient. But as we saw with Token Druid in Boomsday and Rosticon's Rumble, the deck wasn't really about being efficient, but more so about just making boards until your opponent finally couldn't clear one, and then you just kill them with Savage Roar, kind of regardless of how shitty the board you built actually is. And this card is very good at that. It's 2 boards in 1 card, so this is like forcing a Blizzard and a Flame Strike out of the opponent in that particular matchup. So I think there's a lot of value to be found in this card. However, I do think it's still pretty inefficient. I think even if you're playing a slow token druid deck, I think maybe you don't want to play 2 copies of this card. And as I said, I'm a big fan of Acornbearer, so I think that slow token druid might not even be the way to go. But in a slow token druid, I can see playing this as a one of, or I can even see playing the first or maybe even the second copy in your sideboard in the specialist format, just for those pesky control warrior matchups or whatever. So I'm not really expecting to queue into double Forest Aid decks on ladder very often, but I think the card definitely has some uses. Next up we have Dreamway Guardians, which I'm going to give 5 stars to because I think it's absolutely insane and goes in every druid deck. It's easy to look at this and just think of it as a shitty Firefly, but Firefly was a really overpowered card, so there's room for a card to be worse than Firefly and still be playable, and I think this card is definitely still very playable. We've talked about Token Druid quite a lot. This is 2 bodies on 1 card, and it's pretty efficient. I think you just obviously play this in Token Druid because of Power of the Wild Savage Roar synergies. And don't underestimate the power of Lifesteal in an aggressive Token Druid deck. Having Lifesteal and an aggro mirror means that you can push face while your opponent's kind of forced to trade, because if they go face, they waste 2 of the damage after you've played this card. And you can always just throw down a Savage Roar, and then this thing's gonna Lifesteal for 6 instead of 2, which is really gonna force the opponent to trade. So I think the Lifesteal is actually like pretty relevant on this card, even if you don't typically play little Lifesteal minions in aggro. And of course, beyond Token Druid, there's also a Heal Druid being pushed in this expansion. This card seems very good for Heal Druid, just a nice, cheap, efficient way to get some healing for some Lifeweaver procs or start working on your Crystal Stag. But I think regardless of Token or Heal Druid synergies, I think this is just a good anti-aggro card for Druid. We don't have Jasper Spellstone anymore, we don't have the Armor Out of Branching Paths or Spreading Plague, so Druid does have to actually respect aggro boards, and I think this is a very good way to do it. I built like 6 or 7 Druid decks, and 2 copies of this went in every single one of those decks. So 5-star card, play it in all your Druid decks. Next we have Lifeweaver, some more of that healing Druid synergy. And this is a pretty powerful effect, just randomly generating Druid spells. My main problem with this card, and with the healing Druid archetype in general, is that the healing available to Druid kinda sucks. As far as class cards go, we're looking at like Healing Touch and Ancient of Lore, both of which are probably pretty unplayable. And then if we're looking at neutral cards, we do have Ziliax, we have Rotten Apple Bomb, which might be okay. But beyond that, you're looking at like Earthen Ring Farseer and Life Drinker, which are pretty sketchy. But of course this set did also add some new healing synergies for Druid, a couple of which we've seen already. with Dreamway Guardians and Crystal Power, both of which I reviewed pretty favorably. And compared to some of the other healing synergies that Hearthstone has printed before, Druid actually has pretty easy access to damaging itself. They can always just hero power and run into a minion to damage themselves. They can cast Pounce for 0 mana, and then you don't even have to worry about the armor that your hero power gives you. Or you can just play a neutral card like Crystallizer, damage yourself for 5, and then you can start healing up stuff with your Lifeweaver. And of course, it's not just healing your hero that counts for this card and the other healing Druid cards, you can heal your minions. And I think that might be some of the strength of this card. It comes down early in the game, and for its mana slot it has a lot of health, which is really what you want when you're trying to heal stuff up. 3 mana 2/5 is a pretty solid stat line. And even though I don't really think the healing Druid deck necessarily cares that much about an effect like this, it's kind of hard to just find good playable 3-drops. So you might just play this mostly because it's a 3 mana 2/5, and then maybe half your games or something you draw a card off of it. So I'm going to give it 4 stars, because I think if the healing Druid deck is a thing, you're probably going to be playing a couple copies of this and that as a pretty reasonable 3-drop. Outside of a dedicated heal Druid deck, I think this probably won't see too much play. I could see some sort of slow combo Druid deck playing, like a couple copies of Crystal Power, a couple Dreamway Guardians, but I don't really see the decks being able to play any other reliable healing, and I think you probably need more support than those 2 cards to support Lifeweaver. But In-Heal Druid, probably a good card. And speaking of In-Heal Druid, probably a good card, we've got Crystal Stag. So I guess the first thing I want to note about this card is if you can't activate the battle cry on it, it's still not like the absolute most terrible card you can be playing. It's pretty comparable to like Druid of the Claw, right? A 4 mana 4/4 attack thing. But when you can activate the battle cry, this card is insane. 5 mana for 2 4/4 rush minions? That's just absolutely absurd. And luckily for fans of the Crystal Stag, I think the condition for the battle cry is actually pretty easy to activate. I mean, you just have to cast like 1 copy of Crystal Power and you're good to go. Or you need your Dreamway Guardians to each lifesteal for 1, and then you drop a Life Drinker on turn 4 or something. I think this card is pretty easy to activate. When it is active, I think it's absolutely insane. And I think this card is powerful enough. Like, it's the reason to play Heal Druid, and I think it's powerful enough that Heal Druid might not just be some random meme deck. If Heal Druid ends up being a tier 1 deck, this is a 5-star card for sure, but I just don't have quite that much faith in the archetype, although I do think it looks pretty reasonable. Next up we have Crystalsong Portal. I think the first thing to note about this card is that 2 mana draw 3 is very efficient, 3 cards is a lot of cards. And also it's giving you Druid minions, and Druid minions are pretty good. You can be hitting like Druid of the Claw, or Keeper of the Grove. Like, you don't put Keeper of the Grove in your deck on purpose, but if you just end up with it, it's pretty playable. You can get big stuff like Scenarius, you can get little stuff like Acornbearer. So just a lot of useful stuff you can pick up from this. And you're getting 3 cards, so even if one of the 3 cards isn't that good, even if you end up never playing it, it's still 2 mana draw 2, which is like pretty good. But on that note, Crystalsong is kind of a weird card, because the second copy has really poor synergy with the first copy. Because like I said, sometimes you get some big unplayable idiot that you're never going to get to actually cast, and then you don't meet the condition when you draw your second Crystalsong Portal, and you don't get to draw 3 cards. And it's also pretty bad if you play cards like Leroy Jenkins in your deck, or even if you just main deck a Scenarius in your token Druid, because it's not always easy to get those cards out of your hand. And I think that's going to be the downfall of this card, and why I don't expect it to see too much play, because kind of just regardless of what Druid deck you're playing, it's actually pretty difficult to completely run out of cards. If you're playing aggro, you're probably going to have a Leroy Jenkins or something in your deck. I was playing Mad Hatter in one of my builds. Sometimes that's a card that's kind of hard to get out of the hand, or just like any 4-drop really can be kind of awkward in an aggro deck. Or if you're playing like a bigger token Druid, things like Scenarius, If you're playing a 6-drop like Tending Torrent or something, those can be hard to get out of the hand. Or if you're playing some sort of combo deck, like Dreampetal Florist or Malagos might be sitting in your hand all game, so it's pretty hard to use a card like this. Now, it is worth noting that recently we've seen the power of Master's Call and Raiding Party. Cards that just draw 3 cards for a pretty low mana cost can be pretty insane, even when they have heavy restrictions on what they can draw. And it's worth noting that I seriously underestimated both of those cards in my last card review. But I don't think Crystalsong Portal is quite there as a playable card. Next up we have Keeper Stalladris, which just looks like a pretty insane card to me. Obviously it's reminiscent of Fandral, but instead of Fandral giving you immediate tempo, this thing gives you a ton of value. Now, unlike Fandral, Keeper Stalladris is not totally insane with Nourish. That was like one of the most insane things Fandral could do, was you just play it on 4, it sticks, cast Nourish, and you basically just win that game because it's so insane. But I do think depending on the matchup, the raw amount of value you can get out of this card does match the value and tempo you could get out of Fandral. I think the one thing that's potentially going to hold this thing back is that there's such a small pool of choose one spells in Druid right now. And keep in mind, it is spells only, so it doesn't work with, like, Druid of the Claw or whatever. But right now there's Nourish, Power of the Wild, and Wrath. And the new card Crystal Power, and that's like one of the reasons that I gave Crystal Power a pretty favorable review, because it's one of only like 4 playable choose one spells that Druid has access to. There's also a couple others. Maybe you can like sneak a Starfall into your deck or something, but I don't think you're playing Mark of the Loa or Mark of Nature, I think is the other one. So this card on its own is completely insane. Sometimes you just River Croc it down against aggro and that's fine. So much value against slower decks, but it's hard to find a pool of playable cards to go along with it. I found that I was only really playing this in decks that could play 2 copies of Wrath and some combination of Power of the Wild and Crystal Power. But I do think this card will see at least some amount of play. If there's like a slow token Druid, it's definitely going to be able to support this card. And in the future, like, if the next set prints 1 playable choose one spell for Druid, I think this card is going to be absolutely insane. Just a ridiculous power level on this card. And finally for Druid, we have Lucentbark. So it pains me to do this, but I'm going to have to give this guy 2 stars. I really like the card a lot. Sharazin was actually one of my favorite cards in Ungoro. A little bit sad to see it go. But I think this guy just doesn't quite have enough support to be playable. I listed some of the healing options that Druid has access to, talking about Lifeweaver, and they're pretty sketchy. I think it's hard to find enough playable healing cards to make the deck in general playable, like just to support Crystal Stag. And this thing needs way more support than that, because every time you want to revive it, you have to find 5 healing, which I think is pretty difficult to do. And on top of being pretty difficult to support, I think it might just be too slow for the Crystal Stag deck. I could see Crystal Stag being like the top end in Heal Druid, because it really seems like more of a tempo card, and like Lifeweaver is a tempo card, it's 3 mana 2/5. And to get full value out of this thing, you probably have to revive it more than once, I would think, because 8 mana is a lot. You're putting a lot of mana into a 4/8. So I think you need to like play it on 8, revive it on 9, and then revive it again on 10. Before you're really happy about it. And I think there's a good chance Healing Druid just isn't getting to turn 10 a lot of the time. If that deck does get to turn 10 though, this is a pretty interesting card with Countess Ashmore, because this is your Death Rattle minion, and then you can also draw like Ziliax or something, which supports the Lucentbark. So that's kind of an interesting take on the card. But in general, I think it's just going to be a bit too slow and doesn't have quite enough healing support. So that's all the Druid cards, and looking at them, they got at least 2 pretty insane cards, and a handful of others that I think are pretty playable. So Druid might actually be in a pretty reasonable spot in the coming expansion, despite losing all of its insane Year of the Mammoth cards. I think Aggro Token Druid is looking like a real contender with Acornbearer. I think a slow token Druid looks pretty reasonable. It got a lot of pretty fine tools in this expansion. I think a mid-range heal Druid could be competitive because I think the Crystal Stag is an absolutely insane card. And it didn't really get much support, other than just like a couple generically good spells. But I built a Malagos Druid that plays Geppetto, and it actually seems pretty nice. That Geppetto card seems absolutely insane. And both Dreamway Guardians and Crystal Power seem pretty okay in that deck. So I think Druid has several decent shots at being playable.